The winter of 1878 came down on the Dakota Territory like a hammer. It was not a season that arrived with gentle grace, with the soft poetry of the first snowfall. It was an invasion. The cold did not knock before it entered. It kicked the door from its hinges and lived in the corners of every room, a thief that stole warmth from the hearth and breath from the lungs. The land itself, a rolling ocean of grass in the summer, became a flat, white desert of iron, hard and unforgiving under a sky the color of slate. For the settlers in the small, unnamed cluster of cabins huddled by the creek, it was a familiar enemy. But this year, the enemy felt stronger, more determined. The cabins were built as they had always been built, according to a logic passed down from fathers to sons, a stubborn tradition carved from hardship. They were made of thick cottonwood logs, felled and stripped by hand. The gaps were chinked with a mixture of mud and dried moss, a temporary mortar against an eternal wind. Inside, a great stone fireplace stood against one wall, a greedy god that demanded constant tribute. To live through the winter was to feed the fire. The entire rhythm of life contracted to this single, desperate task: cutting wood, hauling wood, splitting wood, and feeding it, piece by piece, into the hungry orange maw, only to watch its heat rise and vanish into the timbered ceiling or seep through the 1,000 tiny cracks in the walls. The cold was a physical presence. It laid a fine, white lace of frost on the inside of the walls, even inches from the roaring fire. It found the smallest gap in the chinking and screamed through it like a knife, a high, thin whistle of malice that could cut through 3 layers of wool. Families slept huddled together under piles of blankets and buffalo robes, their breath pluming in the frigid air of their own homes. The fire could keep you from freezing, but it could not make you warm. It was a battle of survival, fought inch by inch, cord by cord, and every year the winter won small victories, leaving behind empty chairs and quiet cabins come the spring thaw. This year, the struggle began earlier. By October, the creek was frozen solid enough to hold a wagon, and the wind had already stripped the last brave leaves from the trees. The community felt a collective anxiety, a tightening in the gut. They saw it in the way the squirrels worked with a frantic energy, and in the early, southward flight of the geese. The old hands, men who had seen a dozen such winters, nodded grimly to each other. "This will be a bad one," they would say, their words turning to smoke in the air. They laid in more wood than ever before, patched their chinking with religious fervor, and still they knew it would not be enough. The conventional methods, the time-honored ways, were failing them before the first true blizzard had even arrived. In their midst lived a woman named Eliza. She was a widow, her husband taken by a fever 2 summers prior, and she was seen as a quiet, slightly sorrowful figure, notable only for her isolation. She had 2 small children, a boy of 8 named Samuel and a girl of 6 named Lily. She was an outsider not by birth, but by temperament. While other women gathered to talk and mend, she was often seen walking the prairie alone, or sitting with one of the heavy, leather-bound books her husband had brought with him from the old country. He had been an engineer in Germany, a man of diagrams and principles, of levers and pressures, and he had left her with not much money, but a mind filled with his strange and wonderful ideas. Eliza watched her neighbors. She saw Thomas, the settlement's most respected builder, a man whose hands were as broad and tough as oaken planks, spend a week reapplying mud to the gaps in his cabin walls. She saw the other men hauling sledges of wood from the copse, their faces already worn with the effort that would define the next 6 months. She felt the same biting drafts in her own cabin. She saw the fear in her children's eyes when the wind rattled the door, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the air, that the old way was a losing fight. The logs were thick, the fire was hot, but the cold was smarter. It didn't fight strength with strength. It won by attrition, by finding the weaknesses. One evening, while sitting by her own meager fire, watching the flames dance, she remembered a conversation with her husband. He had been drawing in a notebook, sketching out designs for bridges and gearworks. He had tapped the wall of their cabin. "This is wrong," he had said, his accent still thick. "We fight the cold like a bull. We should fight it like a fox. We try to make more heat. We should be trying to lose less." He had drawn 2 parallel lines on the page. "The best insulator is not wood, not stone," he had told her. "It is air, still air, the air that is trapped." The idea came to her then, not as a flash of brilliance, but as a slow, dawning memory, a piece of forgotten wisdom. She went to the chest that held her husband's belongings and pulled out one of his books. It was filled with diagrams of kilns and foundries, but also of houses from the frozen north of Europe. She saw walls that were not a single solid barrier, but a hollow space, a cavity. And she read the notes he had scribbled in the margins, his precise, elegant script describing the principle of insulation. It was not the wall itself that kept the warmth in. It was what was inside the wall. The next morning she began her work. She did not try to patch her existing cabin. She would build a new one, a smaller one, but a smarter one. She paced out a rectangle on a flat piece of ground near her home, but it was a strange rectangle. It was composed of 2 outlines, an outer and an inner, with a gap of a full foot between them. Samuel watched her, his brow furrowed. "Why are you making 2 houses, Mama?" he asked. She smiled and patted his head. "We are making 1 house, with a warm coat." Thomas was the first to notice. He was walking his trap line and saw the peculiar shape marked out on the frosty ground. He stopped, leaning on his rifle, and watched as Eliza began to dig the shallow trenches for the foundation. He was not a cruel man, but he was a proud one, a man who believed in the tangible reality of his own experience. What he saw made no sense. He walked over, his boots crunching on the stiff grass. "What foolishness is this, Eliza?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. It was not a question. It was a judgment. She looked up at him, her face smudged with dirt, and explained her idea simply. She would build 2 walls, a lighter one on the inside and a standard one on the outside, and in the space between she would pack prairie hay, from the foundation to the rafters. Thomas stared at her, as if she had suggested building a house from water. He was silent for a long moment, and then he laughed. It was not a friendly chuckle. It was a deep, booming laugh of disbelief, a sound that carried on the wind and made other settlers pause their work to look. "Hay?" he finally managed to say, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "You mean to build a barn for mice? A tinderbox waiting for a spark? Woman, the winter will tear that paper house apart, and the first stray ember from your fire will burn you and your children in your sleep." He shook his head, the judgment now final. "Stick to what you know. Let the men do the building. We will help you chink your walls proper." He walked away, still shaking his head, and the story of the widow's hay house spread through the settlement before noon. The skepticism was universal. It became the local joke, a source of grim amusement in a time of growing fear. Men would stop by her plot of land on their way to the woods and offer their own derisive advice. "Be sure to leave a door for the mice, Eliza, so they don't have to chew their way in," one called out. "I hear the wolves are cold this year, too. They'll thank you for the warm nest," another shouted, followed by the laughter of his companions. The women were quieter, but no less certain. They would whisper amongst themselves at the trading post, pitying looks on their faces. "Poor thing. The grief has unsettled her mind," they would say. "Those children won't see Christmas." Eliza heard the whispers and the laughter. They stung, but they did not stop her. Her husband had faced skepticism his whole life. He had believed in principles, in the unseen laws of physics that governed the world, and he had taught her to trust them more than the loud opinions of ignorant men. Her motivation was not pride. It was the image of her daughter Lily's small hands, blue with cold. It was the sound of Samuel's cough in the night. She was not building a monument to a strange idea. She was building a fortress for her children, and the mockery of her neighbors was just a winter wind she had to endure. So she worked, alone. The sun of late autumn was weak, but she worked from its rising to its setting. The physical labor was immense, a crushing weight on her slight frame. She could not fell the great cottonwoods for the outer wall herself, so she traded her husband's good German rifle for a dozen large logs from Thomas, a transaction that only confirmed to him her foolishness. But the inner wall she built herself from smaller aspen trees, which she cut with a bucksaw, the blade singing a rhythmic, lonely song in the quiet air. She learned the feel of the axe, the heft and balance of it. She learned to notch the logs with a patient, careful hand, fitting them together so snugly that barely a sliver of light could pass through. Her hands, once soft, became a cartographer's map of her labor, blistered and calloused, crisscrossed with the fine, deep lines of effort. Every muscle in her back and shoulders screamed in protest at the end of the day, but every morning she rose before the sun and returned to the task. Samuel helped where he could, dragging smaller branches and clearing stones, his small, serious face a mirror of her own determination. While she built her strange double walls, she watched the community prepare in their traditional way. They worked quickly, with a sense of frantic urgency. Their axes fell in a flurry of blows, their movements hurried and imprecise. They slapped mud and moss into the gaps between their logs, a task that needed to be done every year because the shifting of the logs and the gnawing of the frost always broke the seal. They were busy, but theirs was the busyness of running in place. They were repeating the same actions that had failed them before, only this time with more desperation. Their work was a prayer against the cold. Hers was an equation. The most arduous task was the hay. The prairie grass was already dry and brittle, and she spent 2 weeks cutting it with a long, heavy scythe. The rhythmic swing and pull was a form of meditation. She worked in ever-widening circles, the silence of the plains broken only by the shush of the blade and her own steady breathing. She raked the cuttings into great mounds, leaving them to cure in the weak sun, turning them each day so they would be perfectly dry. Any moisture left in the hay would lead to rot and mold, turning her insulation into a damp, cold mass. Precision was everything. Then came the packing. Once the 2 walls were erected and the roof was on, she began the final, crucial step. She climbed a ladder and began feeding the dry, fragrant prairie hay into the 1-foot cavity between the logs. She fed it in by the armful, and then, using a long, smooth pole, she tamped it down. She packed it with a relentless pressure, forcing the air from between the stalks, creating a dense, solid mass of insulation. It was slow, dusty, exhausting work. The hay filled the air, getting in her hair, her clothes, her lungs. But as she worked, she could feel the wall changing. It was becoming not just a barrier, but a buffer. Samuel, watching her from below, asked, "Why does hay make it warm?" Eliza paused, leaning on her tamping pole, and explained it in the simple terms her husband had used for her. "The hay itself isn't warm, my love," she said, her voice slightly muffled by the dust. "But it is full of tiny, tiny pockets. When we pack it tight, it traps the air in all those little pockets. The wind can't move the air, and our fire can't lose its heat to it. The hay is like a blanket we are wrapping around our house to hold the warmth in." He nodded, as if this were the most logical thing in the world. For him, it was not foolishness. It was his mother's work. She finished the last section of wall just as the first true snow began to fall. Fine, hard pellets that skittered across the frozen ground. Her cabin was small, barely more than a single room, but it was finished. From the outside, it looked thicker, more solid than the others, its log ends protruding further at the corners. But to the casual eye, it was just a crude, oversized cabin. The secret of its strength was invisible, packed away in the dark. As the snows deepened, the jokes about the hay house subsided, replaced by the grim, all-consuming work of staying alive. The first month of winter was hard, but manageable. The cold was a constant, grinding presence, but the blizzards held off. In her small cabin, Eliza noticed the difference immediately. She used less than half the wood she had used the previous year. A small, steady fire was enough to keep the room comfortable, not just bearable. The inner walls, the thin aspen logs, were never cold to the touch. There were no drafts. The silence was the most remarkable thing. The howling of the wind was a distant, muted thing, no longer a shrieking intruder in their home. Her children played on the floor, their cheeks rosy, their laughter filling the small, warm space. Then the great storm arrived. The settlers called it the White Death, and it came not as a storm, but as a war. It began with a sky that turned from gray to a bruised, heavy purple. The wind fell utterly silent, an eerie, breathless pause that was more menacing than any gale. The temperature began to plummet, dropping 20 degrees in a single hour. The air grew so cold it felt sharp in the lungs, a physical pain with every breath. And then the wind returned, not as a whistle, but as a solid wall of force, driving a blinding, horizontal snow before it. The world outside the window did not disappear. It was erased. For 3 days, the blizzard raged. It was a living thing, a predator of unimaginable power. The wind was a physical blow, a constant, violent pressure against the walls of the cabins. It found every crack, every flaw, every moment of lazy construction, and exploited it without mercy. The fine, flour-like snow was driven through the smallest gaps in the chinking, piling up in ghostly white drifts on the floors inside. The sound was a deafening, continuous roar, a noise that seemed to be bent on shaking the world to pieces. Inside Thomas's cabin, the largest and supposedly best built in the settlement, the situation was desperate. His fireplace, a monument of river stone that could hold 4-foot logs, burned with a furious intensity, but it was a losing battle. The heat was ripped away as soon as it left the hearth. The log walls were coated in a thick, crystalline layer of frost. His wife and 3 children were huddled under a mountain of blankets on their bed, their faces pale, their bodies shivering uncontrollably. Thomas stood before the fire, feeding it log after log, his face grim. The cold was winning. It was inside the house with them. He had started the storm with a massive cord of wood stacked against his outer wall. By the morning of the second day, it was half gone. By that evening, it was dwindling at an alarming rate. The wind seemed to suck the heat right through the solid wood. He could feel the cold radiating from the walls, a palpable, draining force. He stuffed rags into the gaps where the chinking had failed, but it was like trying to dam a river with a handful of sand. The cold poured in. He was a master builder, the man everyone came to for advice, and his fortress was failing. His family was in danger, and his pride was turning to ash in his throat, colder than the wind. Now, shift the focus. Inside Eliza's cabin, there was a profound and startling peace. The roar of the blizzard was a distant hum, a rumor of a war being fought somewhere far away. The walls did not radiate cold. They were neutral, holding the warmth of the room within them. A small, calm fire flickered in her modest hearth, consuming a single small log every hour. The heat it produced stayed in the room, creating a pocket of gentle, even warmth. There was no frost on the inner walls. There were no drafts. Lily was asleep in her small bed, a single quilt covering her. Samuel sat at the small wooden table, carefully drawing a picture of a horse on a piece of slate. Eliza sat in her rocking chair, mending a tear in his trousers, her movements calm and unhurried. The air was not hot, but it was warm. It was the steady, reliable warmth of a safe harbor. The packed hay, the invisible shield she had built with her own 2 hands, was holding back the siege. The principle her husband had taught her was true. Still air was the greatest insulator of all. Her house was not fighting the cold, it was ignoring it. On the 3rd day, the crisis in Thomas's cabin reached its peak. The last of the wood was gone. The fire dwindled to a bed of glowing, dying embers. The temperature in the room plummeted, quickly becoming as dangerous as the air outside. His youngest child, a boy of 5, was coughing, a weak, shallow sound that terrified him. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. They would not survive the night. He looked at the faces of his family, blue-lipped and shivering in the gloom, and knew he had to do something. His pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. There was only one place to go. Bundling himself in every layer he owned, he faced the storm. The moment he opened the door, the wind tore it from his grasp and slammed it back against the wall. He plunged into a world of white chaos. The snow was so thick he could not see his own feet. The wind knocked him to the ground twice before he had gone 10 yards. He navigated by memory, by the faint impression of where Eliza's cabin should be. It was a journey of 100 yards that felt like 100 miles. He was driven by a single, desperate image. The memory of a thin column of smoke he had seen rising from her chimney earlier, a steady, unwavering plume in the heart of the gale. He stumbled against her door more than he knocked on it, his body a block of ice, his beard frozen solid to his face. He pounded on the wood with a numb fist, his shouts swallowed by the roar of the wind. For a moment he feared he was too late, that they had succumbed, that his hope was as foolish as he had once claimed her to be. Then the latch clicked, and the door swung inward. A wave of warmth washed over him. It was not the scorching, dry heat of a roaring fire, but a gentle, steady, and profound warmth that seemed to fill the air itself. It was the most shocking sensation of his life. His eyes, blinded by the snow, slowly adjusted to the calm, lamplit interior. He saw the small, efficient fire. He saw the little girl, sleeping peacefully. He saw the boy at the table, who looked up at him with curious, unafraid eyes. And he saw Eliza, standing by the door, her expression not of triumph, but of simple, human concern. The contrast was a physical blow. He had just left a tomb of ice that he had built with his own expert hands. He had stepped into a haven of warmth, built by a grieving widow with a foolish idea. The air in her home was calm. The silence was absolute, save for the crackle of the small fire. He stood there, dripping melted snow onto her clean-swept floor, and he could not speak. The words he had used to mock her, tinderbox, mouse nest, foolishness, they echoed in his mind, the hollow pronouncements of an arrogant fool. He was wrong. It was the most complete and undeniable realization of his life. He was wrong, and she was right. Eliza did not say, "I told you so." She did not gloat. She saw the desperation and the frostbite on his face, and she acted. "Come in," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Close the door." She helped him out of his frozen coat and sat him in the chair by the fire, the one her husband had made. She ladled a steaming mug of broth from a pot simmering by the hearth and pressed it into his trembling hands. The warmth seeped into his fingers, painful and welcome. He drank it greedily, the hot liquid a shock to his frozen insides. "My family," he finally managed to stammer, his voice hoarse. "The fire is out. The wood is gone." Eliza simply nodded. "Bring them here," she said. It was not a question or a negotiation. It was a simple statement of fact, an act of grace that cut him deeper than any rebuke. He had offered her scorn, and she was offering his family salvation. He nodded, unable to meet her eyes, and with a strength born of renewed hope, he went back into the storm to retrieve his wife and children. They came in a huddled, frozen line, stumbling into the miraculous warmth of Eliza's small cabin. Like their father, they were stunned into silence. Eliza and Samuel gave up their own beds, making pallets on the floor for the newcomers. The small room was crowded, but it was alive, and it was warm. Later that night, another family, the Jensens, saw the light in Eliza's window and made the same desperate pilgrimage, their own woodpile exhausted. Eliza took them in as well. Her little hay house, the subject of so much ridicule, had become an ark in the frozen white flood. When the blizzard finally broke on the fourth day, the world was transformed. The sun shone on a landscape of immense sculpted drifts, a world of silent, beautiful desolation. The news of what had happened at Eliza's cabin spread through the settlement as quickly as the thaw. People emerged from their own cold, battered homes and saw the group of survivors at Eliza's door, their faces etched with a mixture of exhaustion and awe. The story was told in hushed tones, first by Thomas, then by the Jensens. They described the impossible warmth, the quiet, the sheer, inexplicable success of her design. Curiosity replaced skepticism. One by one, and then in small groups, the settlers came to see. They did not come to mock. They came with a tentative, almost fearful respect. They stood outside first, just looking at the cabin, as if trying to discern its secret from the log ends and the roof line. Then they would knock timidly on the door. Eliza would let them in, and each person had the same reaction. They would stop just inside the doorway, their faces slack with disbelief, and feel the air. They would walk over and touch the inner wall, expecting the biting cold of their own homes, and find it almost warm. They would look at the small, unassuming fire, and then back at the walls, their minds struggling to reconcile what they saw with what they felt. The laughter was gone, replaced by a profound and humbled silence. The men who had shouted jokes now stood shuffling their feet, their hats in their hands, unable to meet Eliza's gaze. The women who had pitied her now looked at her with an expression of deep respect. She had not just built a better house, she had revealed a deeper truth, and in doing so, had exposed the poverty of their own stubborn traditions. A few days later, Thomas returned. He came alone this time. He did not bring his family. He brought only his broken pride. He stood before her on the packed snow, the sun glinting on his haggard face. He was the settlement's master builder, a man whose word on wood and stone had been law. He looked at this quiet woman, who had bested the worst winter in living memory, with nothing but prairie grass and a dead husband's idea. "Eliza," he began, his voice thick with emotion. He stopped, swallowed hard, and started again. "I was a fool. I was arrogant, and I was wrong." He finally looked her in the eye. "Teach me," he said. The words were quiet, but they were the loudest sound in the settlement. "Teach me how you did it." Eliza did not hesitate. She harbored no resentment. The goal had never been to prove them wrong. It had been to keep her children safe. She led him around the small cabin, her new student following in her footsteps. She showed him the foundation, the double-set logs. She took a small panel off the inner wall she had designed for repairs, revealing the densely packed hay inside. She let him reach in and feel it. "It is not the hay," she explained patiently. using the same words she had used for her son. It is the air trapped within the hay, a million tiny pockets of still air. The wind cannot move it. The heat cannot escape through it. It is a coat of air. She explained the importance of keeping the hay perfectly dry, of packing it tight. She showed him how she had designed the roof overhang to keep rain well away from the walls, and how she had raised the foundation on a bed of stone to keep out the ground moisture. She explained the principles of thermal mass in her stone hearth, and the design of the flue that maximized heat output. It was a masterclass in applied physics, delivered in the simple, practical language of survival. Thomas listened, his head bowed, absorbing every word. He had spent his life working with wood. She taught him to work with principles. The winter eventually receded, its power broken. It left behind a changed landscape and a changed community. When the spring thaw came and the ground softened, a new sound filled the air. It was not the sound of men patching old mistakes. It was the sound of new beginnings. Led by Thomas, who was now Eliza's most devoted disciple, the men of the settlement began to build. They built new homes for those who had lost theirs, and they retrofitted the old ones. The landscape of the settlement physically changed. Everywhere, the strange, double-walled foundations were laid. Men who had once laughed at the idea now worked with a convert's zeal, carefully notching the inner and outer logs, leaving the precise 1-foot gap between them. The children spent weeks cutting and raking and drying the prairie hay, no longer a worthless weed, but a precious resource, the key to their future. The women learned to pack it into the walls, tamping it down with the same focused patience Eliza had shown. Her design, once the widow's folly, became the blueprint for their survival. The story of the hay-packed houses began to travel. A government surveyor, charting the territory that summer, stopped at the settlement and was amazed by the unique construction. He spent a day with Eliza and Thomas, filling his notebook with sketches and detailed notes. He had never seen anything like it. His official report mentioned the insulated dwellings of the small creek settlement, noting their remarkable resistance to extreme temperatures. A year later, a journalist from Chicago, following up on the surveyor's report, wrote a small article for his newspaper about the ingenuity of the prairie settlers. He called it the grass-walled house. The idea spread, not like a wildfire, but in the slow, steady way that true wisdom does. It was carried by travelers, by new settlers heading west, by letters sent back home. In other small, vulnerable communities across the plains, people began to experiment, building their own versions of Eliza's design. They were building more than just warmer homes. They were building with a new humility, an understanding that the old ways were not always the best ways. The anonymous widow from the Dakota Territory had started a quiet revolution, a revolution not of politics or power, but of common sense. Eliza never sought credit or fame. She continued to live her quiet life, raising her children in the small, warm cabin that had saved them all. Her triumph was not in the praise of her neighbors, but in the simple, profound fact of their survival. She had faced the twin forces of a brutal natural world and a skeptical human one, and she had overcome them not with strength, but with intelligence, not with pride, but with the quiet courage of a mother's love. The legacy she left was written not in books or on monuments, but in the very walls of the homes around her. A testament to the enduring truth that sometimes the most powerful solutions are not found in the grand and the complex, but are hidden in the humble and the overlooked, waiting for a wise and patient hand to reveal them.